I always believed I had a solid marriage, maybe not a perfect one, but stable enough to feel safe. That illusion started to crumble the morning Dylan announced he was taking our daughter, Lily, on a spontaneous weekend trip. He stood in the kitchen with that overly bright smile he used only when he was hiding something, his hands gripping Lily's shoulders like he needed her as a shield. The way he avoided my eyes made my stomach twist, though I tried to pretend it was just stress from work. But deep down, a quiet voice whispered that something was off, and I hated how much it sounded like the truth. Lily, on the other hand, was bursting with excitement, bouncing on the balls of her feet as she told me about the surprises her daddy had planned. She spoke in that breathless, eager tone that made my heart soften despite the unease tightening around my ribs. Dylan ruffled her hair with an almost forced playfulness, then looked at me with a strange mix of impatience and expectation, as though he needed approval that I wasn't giving fast enough. "You've been exhausted lately," he said, offering a half smile that didn't meet his eyes. "This will give you a chance to rest." The implication that I somehow needed to be sidelined left a small sting I tried not to show. I watched them pack from the doorway, noticing how Dylan moved with unusual urgency, triple-checking bags and quietly texting someone between folding Lily's clothes. Every time I stepped closer, he tilted the phone away from me or slid it into his pocket. It wasn't the first time he'd done that, but it felt more deliberate now. Like I wasn't just being excluded from his messages, I was being erased from the narrative altogether. When I asked where exactly they were going, his answer came far too quickly. "Just a cabin up north. You know, father-daughter bonding." He said it in a tone that dared me to challenge him. The drive away from our house felt longer than usual, even though the car disappeared down the street within seconds. The quiet afterward was suffocating rather than peaceful. I moved through the house restlessly, noticing small things I had ignored for months. Dylan's cologne lingering too strongly on his jackets, hotel keycards tucked into drawers with no explanation, and long hairs on his hoodie that definitely weren't mine. I told myself I was being paranoid, that exhaustion and stress were twisting my perception. But the truth was simpler and far more painful. Trust feels different when it starts to break. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed scrolling through old photos of us smiling vacations, holiday dinners, Lily on his shoulders, and felt the widening gap between the life we had and the one we were pretending to maintain. Dylan didn't text to check on me, and when I called to say goodnight to Lily, he claimed their reception was bad. The call lasted barely a minute before he rushed her off the phone. Her small voice sounded distracted, as though someone else was in the room with them, whispering instructions she was too afraid to question. By Sunday morning, I was pacing the living room with a nervous energy I couldn't burn off. The sun streamed through the windows, warm and bright, but all it did was cast light on how empty the space felt without Lily's laughter. I kept glancing at the clock, waiting for the moment they'd walk through the door. The hours dragged, each one heavier than the last, and when their car finally pulled into the driveway, I nearly ran outside just to see my daughter's face. But the moment I saw her expression, something inside me tightened with fear. Lily climbed out of the back seat slower than usual, her demeanor oddly subdued. She glanced at Dylan before approaching me, as if seeking silent permission. Her small hand slipped into mine, warm but tense, and she leaned into me without saying a word. I caught Dylan watching us, his jaw tight, face pale, and his eyes darting to Lily as though he was silently warning her to stay quiet. The atmosphere felt charged, like the calm before a storm that was already forming. When I carried Lily inside and sat with her on the couch, she held my wrist with a grip far too strong for a 7-year-old. I stroked her hair gently, trying not to show how fast my heart was racing. "Did you have fun with Daddy?" I asked softly, keeping my tone light so she wouldn't feel pressured. She looked up at me with wide, conflicted eyes trying to decide whether the truth would get her into trouble. After several seconds that felt like an eternity, she whispered, "Mommy, Daddy told me not to tell you who came with us." My breath caught, the room spinning for a moment as her words settled over me like a cold shadow. Whatever I had feared didn't just feel real now, it stood right in front of me, wearing my daughter's voice. The truth wasn't knocking on the door anymore. It had already walked in. The moment Lily whispered those words, my entire body went cold, but I forced myself to stay calm for her sake. I tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and asked gently, "What do you mean, sweetheart? Who was with you and Daddy?" She hesitated, chewing her lip the way she did when she was afraid of getting in trouble. Her fingers curled in the fabric of my sleeve, clinging to me like a lifeline. I could feel her heart pounding against my arm, a trembling little rhythm that made everything inside me tighten. "It was a lady," she finally said, voice barely audible. "She had long hair, and Daddy said she was his special friend." The words hit me like an icy wave. I kept my face as neutral as possible, but inside, something was cracking open, slow, painful, and impossible to stop. Lily looked up at me anxiously, searching my expression as though she knew she'd just said something dangerous. When I didn't explode, she slowly relaxed against my shoulder, trusting me to hold the truth. I gently guided her through questions without pushing her too hard. She described the woman, her voice wavering. "She sat in the front seat with Daddy, and they held hands sometimes when they thought I was sleeping." A sharp, nauseating twist hit my stomach, but I kept my breathing steady. The sinking realization that my daughter had witnessed something she should never have been exposed to made my throat burn with anger. "He told me not to tell you," she added, burying her face in my sweater. "He said you'd get mad." I held her for a long moment, smoothing her hair while my mind spun out of control. The betrayal wasn't just toward me. Dylan had used our daughter as a shield, dragging her into the middle of his secret life. That crossed a line I didn't even know existed until that moment. But my questions weren't finished, and I needed more clarity, painful as it was. So when she finally looked up, I asked softly, "Did Daddy say this lady's name?" Lily nodded slowly. "Her name is Sienna. She works with him." Of course she did. I had heard that name before, brief mentions in passing. The kind he brushed off as someone irrelevant, someone he barely knew. It felt like all the small red flags I had ignored were suddenly stitching themselves together into a blindingly clear truth. I hugged Lily tighter, swallowing the thick bitterness rising in my chest. When Dylan came back inside a few minutes later, still smelling faintly like the woodsy cologne he always overused when he wanted to impress someone, the air shifted instantly. His eyes flicked from me to Lily and back, reading the tension like a threat. "What's going on?" he asked too casually, wiping his palms on his jeans. His voice cracked on the last word, and that tiny, brittle sound told me everything. He knew Lily had said something. I stood up slowly, placing Lily gently on the couch with a reassuring smile. Dylan watched me like a cornered animal, hyper alert, his jaw working as he swallowed. "We need to talk," I said, keeping my tone even. He scoffed immediately, crossing his arms defensively. "What now, Mara? I can't have one weekend with my kid without you freaking out." It was the same tactic he always used. Deflect, attack, twist the narrative before I could speak mine. I didn't take the bait. "Lily told me there was someone else on the trip," I said calmly. The words hung between us like a blade. Dylan's face went through a rapid series of expressions: shock, fear, rage, then forced composure that didn't fool anyone. "She's confused," he said quickly. "Kids make things up. You know how imaginative she is." He laughed, but the sound was brittle, hollow, and full of cracks. "That's interesting," I replied, folding my arms. "Because she gave a name." His shoulders stiffened instantly, and his entire posture shifted like a man preparing for a fight he was destined to lose. "Sienna," I said clearly, saying it out loud, just to watch the lie drain out of him. For a split second, pure panic flashed across his face before he masked it with indignation. "You're unbelievable," he snapped. "Always inventing problems where there aren't any." The gaslighting felt familiar. He had used it many times before, but this time, something inside me resisted it instead of shrinking. The truth wasn't blurry anymore. It was sharp, undeniable, sitting right beside me in the form of our terrified daughter. I could feel the shift inside myself, the rising certainty that I would not be manipulated again. Dylan stormed into the kitchen, muttering curses under his breath, and I followed, refusing to let the conversation die in his avoidance. "Who is she to you?" I demanded. He spun around, face red, eyes narrowed. "A coworker," he shouted. "Someone I invited because Lily needed a female presence." You're always too busy. The lie was so absurd I didn't even respond at first. I just stared at him, letting silence choke his excuse. Later that night, after he retreated to the bedroom claiming he was done with this nonsense, I sat on the couch with Lily asleep across my lap, my hand resting protectively on her back. Everything felt both painfully clear and horrifyingly uncertain. But one thing was undeniable now. The truth was out, and Dylan was slipping. And the more he tried to bury it, the deeper I knew I had to dig. The next morning, Dylan acted as if nothing had happened, moving around the kitchen with exaggerated normalcy. He hummed while making coffee, clattered dishes loudly, and kept glancing at me with forced casualness. It felt like he was performing, trying to overwrite the previous night with a new script he could control. I watched him quietly from the table, my hands wrapped around a mug I wasn't drinking from. The silence between us had weight thick, uncomfortable, and edged with the truth he was desperate to hide. When Lily wandered in, still rubbing sleep from her eyes, Dylan instantly brightened and scooped her up. "Hey, princess," he said too cheerily, pressing a kiss to her forehead. She stiffened slightly, something I noticed immediately, though he pretended not to. "Tell Mommy we had fun this weekend, okay?" he added, his tone light but his eyes locked intensely on her. It was a message disguised as a request, a warning wrapped in a smile. Lily nodded reluctantly and slid out of his arms, retreating toward me. I pulled her close, brushing her hair back, and whispered that she didn't have to say anything she didn't want to. Dylan's jaw twitched in irritation, but he held his tongue. It was the first moment I fully realized he didn't just want to keep his affair hidden, he wanted Lily complicit. That realization splintered something inside me in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. I knew I needed proof. Not for myself, I already believed Lily, but for what would come next. So after I dropped Lily at school, I returned home and sat in my car for a long moment, gathering strength. The idea of going through Dylan's things felt invasive. But then again, he had invaded every boundary that mattered. I walked inside and headed straight to his office, the place he always guarded most fiercely. My hands shook as I turned the doorknob, but I pushed forward anyway. The room smelled like his cologne and stale coffee. His briefcase sat on the desk, closed but not locked. When I opened it, I expected paperwork, receipts, maybe a stray snack wrapper. But what I found instead made my breath hitch. A hotel key card with a floral design, the kind from boutique hotels, and a folded receipt from a restaurant 2 hours away. 2 entrees, 1 bottle of wine, and a dessert I knew was his favorite. My fingers tightened around the paper until it crinkled loudly. I took photos of everything before putting each item back exactly where I found it. My hands were still trembling, but adrenaline steadied me enough to keep going. I checked his email next, and though he had deleted everything suspicious, he wasn't as thorough as he thought. In the trash folder was a single message scheduled for auto-delete in 24 hours, an email from Sienna confirming a weekend getaway. She mentioned looking forward to more time alone without interruptions. The words made my stomach twist, but they also gave me exactly what I needed. When Dylan came home later that evening, he didn't greet me. He just scanned the house like he was expecting an ambush. His paranoia told me he sensed my shift. "Everything okay?" he asked, trying to sound casual, but his voice cracked slightly. I told him yes, and the way he exhaled too quickly confirmed he was terrified I had discovered more. His fear was almost palpable, and for the first time, I felt the power shifting in my direction. After Lily went to bed, he finally confronted me. "Look," he began, pacing near the kitchen counter, "I think we got off track yesterday. You misinterpreted things." His attempt at composure was flimsy at best. He couldn't meet my eyes for more than a second. "I would never betray you," he added, voice shaky. "And it hurts that you'd even think that." He was trying so hard to rebuild the narrative he wanted me to accept. I let him talk. Every word he spewed made the truth colder and clearer. Once he finished, I reached into my pocket and placed the photo of the receipt on the counter. The color drained from his face instantly. Where did you get that?" he choked out, his voice barely above a whisper. His legs seemed to weaken, and he gripped the counter with white knuckles. "You lied," I said, my voice calm, steady, and almost unfamiliar in its clarity. "You took our daughter to meet your mistress." His eyes flicked wildly toward the hallway, as if afraid Lily might hear. "Mara, please," he begged, stepping forward with trembling hands. It's not what you think. I didn't mean for things to get this complicated. His excuses fell flat, empty, stripped of all their earlier power. I stepped back, refusing his touch. You involved our child, I said firmly. There is no version of this where I forgive that. Dylan's face crumpled, but I felt nothing, not pity, not warmth, not even anger anymore. Just resolve. In that moment, I knew exactly what had to happen next. And for the first time since Lily spoke those heartbreaking words, I felt in control again. Dylan didn't sleep in our bedroom that night, though I hadn't asked him to leave. He paced the living room instead, the glow of his phone illuminating his face every time he checked it, probably waiting for a message from Sienna, or terrified one would come through. I lay awake listening to his anxious footsteps, and every creak of the floorboards reminded me of the lies he had walked through our marriage. It was strange how quickly trust evaporates when truth finally steps into the light. By morning, something between us had snapped so completely that even the air felt different. When Lily woke up and padded sleepily into the kitchen, Dylan tried to act like nothing was wrong, putting on that bright smile he thought could hide everything. She didn't buy it. She clung to me, watching him with wary eyes that broke my heart all over again. Kids always see more than adults think they do. And now, because of him, she saw her father as a stranger. After breakfast, I told Dylan I needed space and that he should stay somewhere else for a while. He tried negotiating, begging, even accusing me of overreacting. But I didn't budge. Every excuse he threw at me only further revealed the cracks he was scrambling to patch. Eventually, he stormed out with the duffel bag, slamming the door hard enough to make the picture frames rattle. The moment he left, I finally exhaled, long, shaky, and relieving. I decided it was time to meet with someone who could help me figure out my next steps. I scheduled an appointment with a family lawyer named Rebecca Nolan, a calm, self-assured woman whose very presence steadied me. She listened patiently as I explained everything, from Lily's confession to the evidence I'd found. She didn't look surprised, just disappointed on my behalf. When I finished, she folded her hands and said, "You have every right to protect yourself and your daughter." Rebecca explained what the legal path might look like, and every word felt like a door opening. She asked for the evidence, and I provided the photos, the email screenshot, and a written statement about Lily's comment. I felt strange turning my private heartbreak into documentation, but it also reminded me of something important. I wasn't powerless. Rebecca told me to keep communication with Dylan minimal and documented. It felt like a cold approach, but one I knew was necessary. That night, after Lily fell asleep, I sat on the couch scrolling through our old photos, vacations, birthdays, moments where I thought our life was real. It was painful to see the smiles and know what had been brewing behind them. But as I looked closer, I began noticing things I had ignored before: his constant checking of his phone, the distant look he sometimes wore, the excuses. He wasn't just cheating with his body. He had long abandoned us emotionally. The truth stung, but it also freed me. The next morning, while I was packing Lily's lunch, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It was Sienna. My stomach tightened as I hesitated, then opened it. She wrote, "I heard you found out. I'm sorry. I didn't know he was married when it started." That was clearly a lie. I had seen her social media. She absolutely knew. But the most shocking part was the last line. "He told me your marriage was over, and that he only stayed for his daughter." The room felt colder as I read it twice. I wasn't sure whether to feel more furious or numb. Dylan hadn't just been lying to me, he had been crafting two separate lives, feeding both of us stories while playing the victim in each. It was manipulative in a way I hadn't fully grasped until now. And even worse, he had used Lily as emotional leverage in his lies. That realization sharpened my resolve like nothing else. I didn't respond to Sienna. Instead, I forwarded the message to Rebecca and blocked the number. A few hours later, Dylan called, but I let it ring. Then he sent a long text full of excuses: how she was lying, how he loved me, how it wasn't what it looked like. It was almost laughable at this point, except nothing about the situation was remotely funny. I archived the message for documentation and didn't reply. Later that afternoon, I picked Lily up from school, and she looked happier than she had been in days. She held my hand tightly, swinging her arm as we walked. "Is Daddy still on his trip?" she asked, her voice quiet but hopeful. I knelt down, brushed her hair behind her ear, and told her Daddy was staying somewhere else for a little while, but she wasn't in trouble and nothing was her fault. She nodded solemnly, leaning into me, and I hugged her tightly. That night, after Lily went to bed, I sat by the window with a cup of tea and watched cars pass by. For the first time since everything began, I didn't feel fear. I felt clarity. Dylan's lies were no longer shadows lurking in corners. They were exposed, undeniable, and unraveling quickly. And soon, he would realize that the consequences he thought he could outrun were already on their way. He had no idea what was coming next. The day everything came together didn't begin with any dramatic sign. It was a quiet Tuesday morning, the kind where the sky is soft and gray, and the world feels slow. Lily was already at school, and I was finishing paperwork Rebecca needed for the next steps. I hadn't spoken to Dylan in days, but he had kept sending messages, half apologies, half anger, none worth responding to. When my phone rang and Rebecca's name appeared, I felt a ripple of nerves move down my spine. She told me the documents and evidence were solid, but she had something else, something I needed to hear in person. Her tone was calm, but firm, and it made my heartbeat quicken. I drove to her office with my hands slightly trembling, unsure if what she was about to reveal would push me deeper into heartbreak or lift me out of it. When I walked in, her expression told me it was the latter. She gestured for me to sit and slid a folder across the desk. Inside was a printed report from a private investigator's background check on Sienna, one I hadn't even known, Rebecca ordered. As I flipped through the pages, my jaw slowly slackened. Sienna wasn't just some woman Dylan had met at a gym. She had a pattern of relationships with married men and a history of extorting money through threats of public exposure. There were even 2 restraining orders from previous partners' wives. The pattern was unmistakable, and Dylan had walked straight into it. Rebecca explained gently that if Dylan continued to communicate with Sienna or allow her near Lily, it would severely work against him in any custody consideration. Hearing it felt like both a punch and a strange comfort. I wasn't imagining his recklessness. He had put our daughter at risk emotionally and possibly legally as well. I felt anger rise again, but this time it wasn't tangled with confusion or sadness. It was clear, focused, sharp. As if on cue, my phone buzzed again while I was gathering the documents. This time it was Dylan's mother, Carol, a woman who had always been warm with me but fiercely protective of her son. Normally I wouldn't have answered, but something told me to pick it up. Her voice was shaky as she asked if Dylan was with me, because he wasn't answering her either. I told her no, and after a long silence, she whispered, "He just called me saying his life is falling apart and it's my fault for raising him wrong." It was exactly the kind of dramatic self-pity I expected from him. When I returned home, Dylan's car was already in the driveway. My stomach tightened as I parked, but I walked in anyway, prepared for whatever storm was waiting. He was sitting on the couch, eyes red, hair unkempt, looking like a man who had finally realized his smooth-talking charm wouldn't fix everything. He stood when he saw me, guilt twisting his face. "We need to talk," he said, voice cracking in a way I had once cared about but now only recognized as manipulation. He launched into a long explanation about how he had cut Sienna off, how she pressured him, how he made mistakes but wanted to put the family first. I stood quietly, giving him the courtesy of finishing, even though his excuses washed over me like static. When he finally paused, wiping the corners of his eyes like a rehearsed gesture, I pulled out the folder from my bag and placed it on the coffee table. His expression shifted instantly, fear simmering in his eyes as he recognized the investigator's letterhead. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I told him exactly what was in the report, how his involvement with a known manipulator jeopardized Lily, and how I had already spoken with a lawyer. Every sentence made him shrink a little more, like the truth was eroding whatever confidence he had left. He tried denying parts of it, but the documentation was irrefutable. His silence afterward was louder than any outburst could have been. Then came the moment that sealed everything. My phone buzzed again, and when I glanced at the screen, a cold heaviness washed over me. It was another message from Sienna, except this time, it wasn't directed at me. It was a screenshot, of a bank transfer request she had sent Dylan, with a caption, "If you don't send it today, I'll tell your wife everything." The timestamp was from only 2 days earlier, long after he claimed he had ended things. I turned my phone toward him without saying a word. He looked like he had been punched. His knees buckled, and he sank onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. For the first time, I saw pure panic, not for our marriage, but because his lies were finally collapsing. He whispered, "I'm going to lose everything." And for the first time, I didn't feel pity. I felt peace. Rebecca helped me file for temporary separation and sole decision-making authority over Lily until everything stabilized. Dylan moved into a rented room across town, still trying to pick up the pieces of the mess he'd created. Meanwhile, Lily and I began building something new, something safe, something honest. She laughed more. I breathed easier. The house felt lighter, without secrets sinking into the walls. And as for Dylan, he learned exactly what happens when the truth finally walks in. His double life had destroyed itself, and all I had to do was stop standing in its way.